Welcome to Not So Quiet on the Western Front, the podcast where we lift the lid, bust the myths, and explore the incredible history of the First World War. I'm Dan Hill, a military historian and battlefield guide specialising in the history of the war on the Western Front.
And I'm Dr. Spencer Jones, author and senior lecturer in war studies at the University of Wolverhampton. In this week's episode, we'll explore possibly one of the best-known actions of the American Expeditionary Force in the Great War, Belleau Wood. We'll look at the build-up, fighting, learning curve, and overall impact of the battle, and perhaps bust a few myths along the way. Well, hello, Dan. Pleasure to be joining you in the third of our set that has been looking at the American Expeditionary Force. We've considered why America entered the war. We've looked at how the American army was raised and trained, or perhaps wasn't so well trained. And we ended our last episode with the American army really on the cusp of seeing serious action. 26th Division had been pretty heavily trench raided near Verdun. But now we're moving on to not, of course, the first action the American army sees in the First World War, but perhaps its first famous action.
Yeah, hi Spence, indeed. We're kind of skipping over the 1st Division action around Cantigny in favour, of course, covering the story in and around Belleau Wood, of course, in June of 1918. It's going to be great. I was there really recently, so it's quite fresh in my mind. It's a fascinating place to explore, and really looking forward to getting stuck into this subject today. So I'm glad that you can join me as well, because after your rant on the Ross rifle last week, I'm surprised you're still alive, actually. There's been some serious kickback on that one. Do you want to redress the balance in any way?
I'm afraid I have to. I have to eat a little bit of humble pie here, because over the course of the podcast, we get lots and lots of emails, lots and lots of social media comments. I'd say 99% of them are lovely, positive, or suggestions. I get a fair number criticising my pronunciation of French place names, for which I accept full responsibility, but I've never had so much pushback as I did from the last episode, where I dismissed the Ross rifle, in my own words, as useless. And I have had several dozen people write to me and explain to me politely, but very firmly, that I'm completely wrong. And in fact, the Ross rifle was a technically very good rifle. It was used by snipers throughout the First World War, and it's still apparently a very good hunting rifle. So may not have been very effective as an infantry rifle in the muddy conditions of the Western Front, but I will redress my comment for the benefit of our Canadian listeners and our rifle enthusiasts. Perhaps I was a little bit too harsh on the Ross rifle, but please, you don't need to write to me and tell me this anymore.
Excellent. Now we've got that out of the way. Fantastic. So, of course, today's subject, as we've already said, is going to be Belleau Wood. It's going to be really a focus on not strictly, but predominantly a single US division. That's going to be the 2nd Division, the famous Indian Head Division, who are going to be fighting in and around Belleau Wood. They're actually quite interesting as a formation in the first place, Spence. They're, of course, going to be part of the original contingent of US divisions to go overseas. They're actually formed overseas as well, if I remember correctly.
That's correct. And the division only comes together once it's arrived in France. That's got some disadvantages. It's not a homogeneous formation when it ships out, but it also has an advantage in that 2nd US Division is one of only 4 fully trained US divisions within France who've gone through the extended additional training that is Pershing really wants to set up for incoming US divisions. Now, given that it doesn't form as a division until it actually reaches France, you might be forgiven, listeners, for thinking this is going to pose quite serious problems for coordination. And as we'll see, in some senses it does. Even at the time of Belleau Wood, 2nd US Division it's a conglomeration of brigades. The advantage is it's got some pretty good brigades in it who are highly trained individuals who've gone through this more extended training period in France, who've had the opportunity to work themselves up to battle speed. And 2nd US Division is also unusual because it contains a contingent of non-US Army troops. And this is, of course, 4th US Marine Brigade.
Yeah, so Marines in the Army. I mean, this is a really unusual thing, even for the time, and certainly today. So a Marine Brigade within an Army division. It's I mean, you could argue, I think, looking at the history of Marines and say, well, what are Marines doing on a land-based campaign in the First World War with nothing bigger than a puddle nearby that represents a body of water? That would be a fair comment. And actually, maybe today when we look at this, we could say, well, US Marines are involved everywhere around the world. and they are involved in land campaigns. Well, that's true, and it's largely true because of Belleau Wood. Because actually, the Americans here, the Marines, and they're highly trained, and I'm sure we'll come into that in a moment, are actually looking for somewhere to show their mettle, to prove their mettle, to show that they can fight. And as a result, they're effectively petitioned to be allowed to send a contingent out to the AEF, a preformed body, by the way, the Marines in this sense. And they're going to go out, they're going to put a very good showing in, albeit a very heavy cost at Belleau Wood. We should caveat this by saying that this isn't an entirely Marine fight. No doubt we'll come into the story as we go through. But it's very interesting. And there's a few dynamics here as well, Spence, at the top of the tree. Because, of course, we're going to have, throughout the war, eventually a Marine commanding second Division. We're also going to have an Army general commanding the Marine Brigade at this case. So that's going to be a guy by the name of James Harbord, who's fascinating. And I'll just touch on him briefly for a second, because I've just been literally looking into his story. This is a guy born in the 1860s. He's no spring chicken by the time he comes out in 1918. In fact, he is, though, fairly well experienced by standards of American experience of the time. So he's been involved in the Philippines. He's been involved in I believe, the Boxer Rebellion, various other locations, Cuba. He's also been involved in the Pancho Villa expedition in 1916, where he's met a guy by the name of Blackjack Pershing. Now, if you want to have a friend in a high place, Blackjack Pershing's probably your guy in the AEF by the time you get to 1918. In fact, Harbord is going to go, only as a major, is going to travel in 1917 to France as part of their early contingent as a chief of staff for Pershing. And he's eventually going to do some pretty impressive staff work. But he's going to lobby Pershing for a battlefield command. And he's eventually going to be given command of our major focus for today, which is the 4th Marine Brigade. By no means a perfect character and quite a few flaws. Also doesn't get along with his divisional commander, Omar Bundy. This is going to become apparent when we get to the Belleau story. But bear in mind, we've got an army general here commanding a Marine brigade, and there are lots of different nuances that come about as a result of that army-marine mix, Spence. It's a fascinating one, really.
It really is. And it speaks to something we've talked about previously in this podcast set about the American Army, that the declaration of war in April 17 is this massive national event, and everybody wants to be part of it from the US military. And there's inter-service rivalry, because in the pre-First World War period, the US Navy has been seen as the predominant military arm of the United States. The so-called Great White Fleet has had its circumnavigation of the world. Military spending, such as it is in the United States, has tended to focus on the naval aspect. And then the First World War comes along, and the army says, this is our moment. This is it. This is the opportunity we've been waiting for to really show what the US Army can do, which has been very much the poor cousin compared to the US Navy. And into this argument and into this inter-service rivalry, of course, fall the US Marines, because initially the army don't want the US Marines and say, look, you're to do with the Navy. We're not interested in you. And it's largely a political decision, because they don't want US Marines stealing any glory or stealing any funding or stealing anything, in fact, from the wider American army. But also, it doesn't really make a lot of sense, because within the American military, the US Marines are probably the most experienced expeditionary element of the US military. It's the US Marines who fought on foreign shores in the Philippines, Haiti, Cuba, etc., etc. In very small numbers, but nevertheless, they've actually done it. And then there's all new American expeditionary force about to go to Europe, and the army, worried the Marines will take the glory from them, say, we don't really want them. And there's a long and complex and quite bitterly fought campaign for the Marines to say, we want to go to and be part of the AEF. The AEF effectively saying, we don't really want you. There's an awful lot of horse trading, political backroom maneuvers, until eventually the army accepts the appearance of 4th US Marine Brigade on the condition that they're going to be part of the American army. They're not going to be independent at this stage. So it's fascinating that even in the midst of preparing America's biggest army in its history up to this point, there's still arguments about, well, who gets to go? And, well, you're not part of our service. Inter-service rivalry it dogs militaries in the First and indeed the Second World War, but after a long argument, eventually the US Marines get accepted in. And that's actually an asset. Given what we've talked about with the US Army's overall training and many of its problems, the one thing the Marines can bring which the Army can't in the same way, is a very high level of individual training, Dan.
Yeah, absolutely. So, the Marines, I suppose the best way to say it is they can be picky. They can afford to be picky. The Army is looking to exponentially expand quickly, and numbers are really going to be key. We've seen the size of the forces out on the Western Front, and the Americans are well aware they need to get a lot of troops and get them very quickly. The Marines, I think, can be a little more selective in that sense. In fact, to the extent that their reputation, amongst others, of being a highly effective force, knowing their stuff, being perhaps a little more, I hesitate to say elite, but that might well be the appropriate phrase to use here, means that they can turn away guys. In fact, they're only really going to accept somewhere in the region of 25, 28% of everybody who attempts to join the Marines. Those, of course, that don't get into the Marines can then go and join the Army with a much higher chance of getting allowed in. But it means that really you're going to get a higher caliber of troop, physically strong, perhaps a little more intelligent, a little more apt to use their initiative on the ground. All of these things are obviously traits that are desirable in any combat infantryman. So we're going to see that really play out in the Marines. And as far as the 2nd Division goes, as far as my thinking takes me, really they're probably the premier fighting force of the Army when that first contingent goes out. And a large part of that is because they've got the 4th Marine Brigade in there, which, by the way, when we go back to the idea of divisions, just to recap that, American divisions in the First World War are enormous. 27,000 men. The main fighting component of which is going to be 2 fighting brigades. It's going to be, in this case, the 4th Marine Brigade paired with an Army brigade. So about 9 to 10,000 of those Marines in the combat elements alone are going to be fighting in and around Belleau Wood.
And that's a powerful addition to any fighting force, but especially powerful for a US Army which lacks experience and which, as we've heard in the previous episode, has not had the level of training that Pershing would have really desired for it, and indeed the Allies would have really desired for it. The Marines can compensate for that to some extent. You mentioned that the Marines can attract a certain type of recruit. And the Marines can because they're already known, not widely known. America is not really a militarized society in any way before the war. But they're known as, if you want to see some action and adventure on land and indeed at sea, then the Marines are the way to go. They've cultivated a strong image, which I should add is backed up by the fact they've actually seen action abroad in a way that the US Army generally hasn't. So they have an image of we are the guys who are going to be out there first. We're the elite. We only take the best. And that's always going to attract a certain caliber of man. And the Marines, as you said, Dan, they can be very, very selective about who they take. They're very, very selective, particularly about if there's any kind of physical problem with you, down to having bad teeth or perhaps an old sporting injury or you've injured yourself farming or something. Even if you're still physically fit, they won't take you. In fact, that actually... They cut off their nose to spite their face a little because they throw out or say you can't come with us to France a large number of veteran Marines who are still very fit on the grounds that, in the words of the Marines themselves, France is no place for old men, which means a large number of veterans are left behind. But those veterans can still play a role because they can start training the incoming Marines. And when you've got this combination of very, very tight selection process with only about 1 in 4 men who apply making it as a Marine, you have some combat experience that can be used for training. There's a tradition and esprit de corps that's there, and it combines very nicely in the Marine Brigade to create this sort of elite unit. It's got that little bit of experience that can be brought into training, very high fitness levels, high intellectual levels. You might remember, listeners, the IQ test the Americans were doing, that we discussed in the previous episode. Individual training is of a high standard, especially fitness. Marines were probably man for man the best trained individual soldiers of the AEF. It's got a very strong esprit de corps as well. The Marines have a reputation that pre-exists, and then it's reinforced again because it's selective about who it takes. And I think the Marine Brigade feels it's got something to prove as well. It's well known what's happened with the arguments between whether the AEF will take the Marines or not, and now what? We're going to prove to the American Army we're better than they are. So you have a lot of things coming together to create a highly trained, not experienced, but certainly very determined formation that fancies itself as elite. What it doesn't have is what none of the AF have, and that is much experience in combined arms. I could almost describe 4th Marine Brigade as very, very good light infantry. Their ability to combine with other elements of the AEF, air power, artillery, machine guns, and tanks, indeed, pretty limited, as is the AEF as a whole at this stage. But if you're looking for some really elite light infantry, you're not going to find much better in the AEF than 4th Marine Brigade.
Yeah, for sure. And we're going to see that at Belleau Wood. I think both sides of that coin, actually. We're going to see where the lack of experience with combined arms can be absolutely deadly, despite incredible courage and determination. It doesn't get you through machine guns and well-in-place Germans. It's as simple as that. We're also going to see it, though, once that learning curve starts to kick in. And I think there's an argument to be made here, maybe we make this later in this episode, that the Americans at Belleau Wood, the Marine Brigade specifically, they managed to compact about a year's worth of BEF learning into about 2 weeks, because by the time they come out the other side of Belleau Wood, some serious lessons have been learned, and that's absolutely to their credit. But in order to get this, Spence, we've got to figure out why people are at Belleau Wood in the first place, because if you were to look at a map of the Western Front from 1917 or 1916, you'd be hard-pressed to find Belleau Wood, because it's a long way behind British lines, and it's certainly not been a heavily fought-over area at that point. So how do we get there? Why is Belleau going to take centre stage?
So this goes back to way back in our series when we discussed the German spring offensives. And when we did those episodes, we looked mainly at the offensives against the British part of the line. But the third of the great spring offensives, so Michael is the first against the British on the Somme, Georgette is the second against the British around Ypres. And then in May, there's a third offensive, which is Blucher-York, which is actually aimed at the French down on the River Aisne. And originally, it's perceived as something of a large-scale diversionary operation designed to achieve the German aim of splitting the British and the French, which the Germans have been trying to do throughout the spring. By attacking the French, it's going to draw off loads and loads of French divisions to try and contain that and leave the British vulnerable. But although it originally conceived as a diversionary operation, it actually catches the Allies, I won't necessarily say unawares, but not well prepared for it. The Allies make a number of mistakes in their defensive preparations on the Aisne, and the Germans break through on the Aisne. And this is an area that's seen intense fighting in 1914 and 1917. It's been deadlocked since 1914. And suddenly the Germans tear across the heights of the River Aisne, down into the valleys below, and make this really dramatic advance that takes them all the way to the River Marne, all the way to where their high water mark had been in 1914. And the Germans succeed beyond their wildest expectations in many respects. They have really hurled primarily French forces back, and they've got to within 60 miles of Paris at their nearest point, or just inside 60 miles, about 59 miles to Paris, and back at the River Marne, where the so-called Miracle on the Marne had stopped them in 1914. And this is an absolutely stunning blow. In some ways, the Germans are as surprised by it as the French, but the French take really heavy damage in this, as the British had done at Michael and Georgette. At least 50,000 Frenchmen are taken prisoner. There's elements of the French army seems to be in disarray. There's some suggestion that parts of the army are panicking. French disagree with that and say it's an ordered withdrawal. But regardless, the Germans have really lunged deep into the Allied position. And if you imagine a sort of shape of the German spearhead, that the spear point is now pointing directly at Paris, which is within striking distance. It's effectively within 3 days of the Germans, which is pretty alarming to everybody. What's not so apparent is that the German offensive is petering out by the start of June, because it's gone so far, it's outrun its logistics. The French resistance is beginning to stiffen around the River Marne. There's a lot of very bitter fighting as both French and Germans try and sort out their positions and try and take tactical points. The offensive is really spent by around about the 3rd of June, although Ludendorff plans to renew it as soon as he can and try and fight his way to Paris. But this isn't apparent at all to the Allies, and the mood actually amongst the Allied camp is really bleak at the start of June, as on the 3rd of June, the Supreme War Council meets, and it's reported that the attitude at the Supreme War Council is one of depression. And Pershing himself actually states privately that the military situation is very grave. That's the mood in the Allied camp. The Germans have torn through this long-held defensive position. They're into the open country. That's an important point. There aren't fixed defenses here. They're within striking distance of Paris. Seemingly, they can't be stopped. Wherever the Germans attack, they break through. Now, perhaps the longer lesson is, well, they break through, but then they run out of steam. That happened against the British on the Somme, the British at Ypres. But that isn't really apparent in June. And if you're a French commander, with Paris so close to being assaulted, to possibly being overrun or surrounded by the Germans, well, you're going to do absolutely everything in your power to try and stop them.
Yeah, and this is really interesting. There's perhaps a slight myth point here. I don't know, Spence, maybe you won't agree with me on this. But of course, when this does occur, and Belleau Wood, when you rightly said the tip of the spear, Belleau Wood is about as close as any Germans are going to get as the crow flies to Paris. What I think is perhaps quite interesting and sometimes overlooked is that Germans aren't really trying to get to Paris at this stage. They happen to be close there, and there may well be, as you say, depending on the situation, a further push towards Paris. But the initial intention isn't to get to Paris. And quite often we hear the phrase associated to Belleau Wood, and then it stopped the German advance on Paris. Bit of a myth for me, that one. I think that's a bit of a stretch. What is possible is that the Germans are actually going to pivot more eastwards and try to grab Epernay, which is an important rail hub. That could certainly happen, and that would throw the French and the Americans in that area into pretty major disarray. But certainly, no matter what happens, it's grave enough that the Americans, who have been behind the lines and ideally would rather another month or two just to build up their strength a little more and kind of learn the ins and outs of fighting on the Western Front, 2 American divisions are not going to get that opportunity. Going to be the 3rd Division, perhaps even our next story when it comes to this podcast set, are going to be in place down around the town of Château-Thierry, not very far from Belleau Wood at all. And to their left, on the second part of the line, we're going to have the 2nd Division, who are going to go into the line around a little village known as Lucy-le-Bocage, which is going to be south of Belleau Wood. Now, just briefly to understand the layout of the ground, I understand this is quite tricky to do via podcast, but we're looking at an area which is to the left of the fairly impressive and a good natural defensive position, the River Marne. To the left of that, or to the west, we have a series of heights that are going to roll through open countryside, starting with height 204, where today you've got the very impressive Château-Thierry Memorial. They're going to run left through an area known as a little village called Belleau, with a large, kind of strange-shaped wood slightly to its south. We've got Bussière, Bourèche, villages either side of Belleau Wood. A little village called Vaux, which is again just to the eastern side of Belleau Wood, and eventually it's going to then go and link up with the rest of the French Expeditionary Corps off to its west there. And it's going to be this area of line that the Americans are going to move into really the end of May, the start of June 1918. And it gives us, I think, a second opportunity to address a famous myth. And this one comes about as a result of a captain in one of the Marine battalions by the name of Lloyd Williams. Lloyd Williams is reputed and famed to have said, coming into the line, bear in mind, I need to set the scene slightly here. So the Americans are going to go in behind the French, who are the northern edge of Belleau Wood. The Americans are going to go in the line to the southern edge of Belleau Wood. The plan at this point then is the French, who are making a retrograde movement, are going to pass through the American positions, and the new American line is then going to hold against the Germans who are pursuing them. That's the general concept. And it's during this movement that we get a conversation that passes between a French major and this American captain, Lloyd Williams, when apparently the French major, in a terrible panic, says, "You men have got to get out of here and retreat. The Germans are coming," and then disappears off down the road in a very kind of cowardly way. To which the reply is famously said, "Retreat? Hell, we just got here." Now, that possibly happens. It possibly happens. What's often missed out of the mix here, Spence, is this is a planned French withdrawal. It's not a blind panic. And it's also possible that actually the French major doesn't say you guys need to retreat. This is something I read recently, but in fact he says you need to reposition your line. You're facing the wrong direction.
Isn't it amazing how military history produces stories that are a part of sort of accepted legend, received wisdom, when in fact, when you look a little bit more deeply at them, they're not quite as compelling as the original pithy line, the pithy story. In defense of the American interpretation of this, one thing that I think we're apt to forget is that the state of confusion actually around this area of the front. The French of course, have taken a huge blow from the Germans during the Blucher-York offensive. They're fighting now from basically semi-open positions. The old trench line's been broken open. They're fighting on ground they haven't fought on for 4 years. taking a lot of casualties. There is a very much a strong sense of confusion and uncertainty all along this part of the front. And into this, you introduce inexperienced American troops who don't share the language, don't share the military culture, aren't really plugged into the French military in the same way. And you can understand that as you're coming forward as Americans, who, as we've stated before, very fired up, very determined to fight, infused with the idea of military exceptionalism, and a French major tells you you've got to fall back, you've got to retreat, you can understand why he might get that sort of response. And you can understand, listeners, why that news would be so well received at home. That this, in some ways, even though, as you've explained so well, Dan, it's not really true. There's definitely qualification to be made. The idea that underpins it, I think the mental image that the Americans of the First World War had of themselves, it's 100% this.
Absolutely. In fact, I was listening to a video about this fairly recently with a colleague that we worked with a little while back about this very subject, and he made a really great point. He said, whilst this line may not work, the concept certainly does work, as you're saying. But he does suggest, he proposes an alternative, though, and it's actually the words of Omar Bundy, the commander of the 2nd Infantry Division. So I'm paraphrasing here, but Bundy effectively says, nothing doing in the retreat line. That's quite simple. He's talking about going forwards. And in fact, this is exactly the case, because really by about the 5th of June, the Germans, really before that, the German advance has stopped. There's maybe a couple of actions. There's some debate about the size and scale of them around the 5th of June, which may see Germans just probing a little more down the road beyond Belleau Wood to see if they can see what kind of line they're approaching. But in effect, that high watermark, that tide that we know the spring offensive for so well, has already stopped by the time the Americans really get into a tough part of the fight. And so we're going to see a switch, Spence, really from what might be considered a defensive posture to the Americans alongside, of course, the French. In fact, supporting the French rather than leading. They're going to be now switching to the offense.
They are. And this is offense in a very difficult set of circumstances. That the line it's not like the Western Front has been, which is well established, well mapped aerially. Now you're fighting in these semi-open positions where people are making trenches. They're making trenches as best they can. They're digging foxholes and machine gun pits. But it's nothing like the Western Front with masses and masses of barbed wire. In fact, one of the notable features of this battle is a relative absence of barbed wire. Although it does play a role, it's not that much of it about, because the armies have gone out of their trenches. Now they're fighting amidst fields and woodlands, small farms, an area that's basically been untouched by war for years and has just returned to civilian life. And so it's a very confused, difficult style of fighting. You don't really know where the enemy is. In fact, one of the reasons the Germans are probing this area on the 5th of June is they're not entirely sure what's in front of them. At the same time, on the American flanks, the French are probing the Germans. And there's this almost a swirling sort of move and counter move all around this area that is very, very confusing. And nobody's entirely sure where anybody else is. Because one of the advantages of if you're fighting from trenches is you know the enemy is in their earthworks. Here, where you've got these dense patches of woodland, which are in full leaf, of course, because it's early June, you've got crops growing in the fields, there's enormous amount of cover, especially from aerial observation. So nobody's entirely sure what's happening, where units are, how to coordinate. And for the Americans too, they're not entirely sure what's going on their flanks. The French aren't always the best at communicating with the Americans and vice versa. And so what's happening down around 2nd US Division and 4th Marine Brigade is units are starting to try and take small tactical points of advantage, which in the grand scheme of things are relatively small locations, but convey advantages. So there's two really that the US are looking at as the Battle of Belleau Wood's about to begin. There's a position, a wooded hill, in fact, called Hill 142, which lies roughly to the north of the US position. And then there's Belleau Wood itself, which lies to the east. And at this stage, I think it's worth sort of emphasizing to the listeners, Dan, that Belleau Wood is a pretty big, dense piece of undergrowth.
Yeah, it really is. In a sense, I think when we talk about the Belleau fighting, we can actually expand that slightly to the flanks and even the open ground around Belleau Wood, because whilst the bulk of the fighting in the latter phases is going to take place within, as you say, this very dense largely untouched wooded area, actually. It's not really been hammered like so many woods have up and down the Western Front. Not a huge amount of fallen tree trunks at first, but it is very densely wooded. It's got, I think more importantly, got very clear open lines of sight, particularly to the south and the west, across a series of wheat fields in which any attacker is going to have to cross in order to get into the wood. That includes from the direction of Hill 142. But yeah, Belleau is no easy place to traverse. Today it's got rides and paths and all kinds of areas running through it. But if you really get yourself into the wood itself, it's a sizable wood. It's got lots of ravines in it, ups and downs. It's not flat ground. It's going to be very tricky to move in and out. And particularly if you're a green unit, maybe seeing action for the first time, as so many Marines are at that point, it's going to be very, very easy to get yourself lost, lose communications, lose coordination. And so it's going to turn into something of a hell for the attackers. But before we get there, of course, they need to get into the wood at all. And you mentioned Hill 142 there, Spence, which I think is a really important point. And we can maybe just go back to the idea of general orders here, because there's some confusion as to what the intention is of the American 2nd Division in this area when the advance restarts. So if we look at 2nd Division orders, we know that the primary order is to support the French, maybe I'll get the number wrong, 167th Division attack to their left flank, which is going to be aimed towards the little village of Bussière, slightly to the north and west of Belleau Wood. Partway along that route is Hill 142. If Hill 142, which is a fairly low prominence, can be captured, it's going to, one, support the French flank, as it's meant to do. It's also going to open a possible second route to make an assault on Belleau Wood. Now, my understanding here, Spence, is this is a discretionary order with regards to the attack of Belleau Wood. Belleau does need to be captured. It's a part of ground that needs to be captured if the advance is to continue generally, but it's not a make or break situation. Certainly, the key heights are going to be 203 over on the right-hand side and the area around Bussière off to the left. So what's your understanding in terms of the story of why Belleau is attacked? Is it simply a 2nd Div are looking for an option to show what they can do?
I think this is a really great example of the fog of war and the friction of war, because Hill 142 is really the immediate objective. It overlooks both any advance on Belleau Wood, and it can potentially put flanking fire into the French who are operating to the north and to the west. So the French want Hill 142 taken out by the Americans, and the Americans want to take it out too. You're not going to do anything else until you've dealt with Hill 142, which is the name, I think the blandness of the name, and we see this in the First World War and the Second World War, belies that this is a tough position. It's going to take some blood and guts to take it. Now, the Americans do storm it. In fact, it begins the action at Belleau Wood. 1st Battalion of the 5th Marines actually storm it around about dawn, cross the wheat fields, and although they come under very heavy fire, and they're not really getting a lot of supporting fire from machine guns or artillery of their own, they actually get onto the hill, they clear out the German defenders there who are somewhat entrenched on this, and then hold the hill against repeated German counterattacks, which reminds me of an old saying on this podcast, things you can be assured of in life, taxes and German counterattacks. And the Marines hold off these counterattacks, which are pretty ferocious. Hill 142 is taken, therefore, but its hold is relatively precarious because the Germans are counterattacking it repeatedly. They're firing on it with artillery machine guns. There's some fire seems to be coming out of Belleau Wood onto it. But this is where I think the friction to do with the wood itself becomes apparent, because most of the start of the 6th of June is focused on Hill 142. It's been captured, it's been held, it's a great feat of arms, it's a bloody feat of arms. The US Marines lose 9 officers and 325 men storming that hill, but it's been done. What happens next? Well, I think we've got 3 real options for why the Americans decide to try and storm Belleau Wood the way they do. One is they may have been asked by the French. And Harbord, who we discussed earlier, claims he was given a direct verbal order by the French general in the area to advance the line. And at the same time, he was assured there is no significant German presence in Belleau Wood. So Harbord said the French had told him to do it verbally. That's tricky because we don't have a written record of that. We've got to take Harbord's word for it, and he decided to do it. Another option, or another possibility, is that Harbord wanted to clear Belleau Wood, or at least part of Belleau Wood, to secure his position at Hill 142, which is taking flanking fire from Belleau Wood. Germans are coming out of the wood, or part of the northern end of the wood, to assault Hill 142. So if you clear the wood, you're going to deal with that, Hill 142 secure. And the third one is that possibly Harbord has got overexcited. He's got fired up in the midst of this battle. He's seen his guys have taken Hill 142. And by early afternoon, they've clearly held it. They've held off the German counterattacks. And he decides now's the time to continue the advance and sweep through Belleau Wood. I don't think we can pin one single reason on Harbord, but my inclination is this is a classic example of friction and fog of war. Whether a French general did tell Harbord to do this, we can never prove because there's no written record. But I think Harbord would probably have wanted to do it, even if nobody had told him to do it. I think perhaps his blood was up. He saw an opportunity, and crucially, and this is the fog of war element, Dan, I don't think he believed Belleau Wood was very heavily held.
No, and this is, I think, comes down to a slightly conceptual problem here. And we can maybe use the French advance on the village of Bussière as an example here. There is genuine frustration in the early stages of this attack. One thing to mention here, Harbord is no friend of the French. He does not like the way that they act. He does not like the way that they advance. He feels that they've really been smashed about too much in the previous years of the war to be effective, and he thinks they're quite timid. And this is where we see a big difference, because the French advance of Bussière, which is gonna lead the assault here, compared with the American assault on Hill 142, which is going to be the supporting element, they're very different in style. By this point in the war, wave attacks, attacking in line, densely packed formations, little artillery preparation, no cooperation with all arms. It's not really done anymore. Things aren't done that way. Things are going to be much more meticulous. They're going to be slow. They're going to keep casualties down. That's not the way the assault on Hill 142 is going to go, and it's certainly not the way the attack on Belleau Wood is going to go on the 6th of June, 1918. I think there may be an element here, Spence, of frustration on Harbord's side, looking at the French advancing slowly and methodically towards their objectives, and he's saying, we can do better than this. We can really drive forwards. Why are we watching these guys moving so slowly? His job effectively has been done by the end of the morning on the 6th of June, and he's looking around. He's now got guys ready in position. He's got this big lumbering division, or part of it, which is actually hard to move. He's for once got them in place, and he's got targets ahead of him. And I think he's going to see this, and he's saying, I'm going to show what we can do. Unfortunately, that's going to come with a very heavy cost. And as always with the Great War, that heavy cost is going to be paid in lives.
It is. And this is, I think you captured something about probably Harbord's attitude. A really good point. He was no friend of the French. And listeners who followed our last episode will know that there was certainly an unwillingness within parts of the US Army to accept the recommendations or indeed the fighting methods of the other allies, as they weren't American. And I think Harbord very much falls into this. And given all that we've just said, he sees an opportunity to turn a local tactical victory at Hill 145 into a much wider victory, sweep not only into the woods, but actually through the woods and beyond, and really win a significant victory, move the Marines forward, play a big role. The problem is he's made he goes on to make a number of mistakes, military mistakes, which I think are born of inexperience, perhaps born of a certain amount of overconfidence, and born of the fog of war. And the big one is he doesn't know, in fact, nobody really knows what exactly is in Belleau Wood. The information that's come down to Harbord is very, very confused. French air reconnaissance has taken ground fire from the woods. Well, that doesn't necessarily mean it's heavily held, but it certainly means there's Germans in there. A US reconnaissance patrol had actually entered the woods on the 4th of June and had encountered Germans, had heard them speaking, had observed them, and had fallen back. So it's definitely Germans in the woods. French intelligence that Harbord has available suggests that the wood is very lightly held, effectively an outpost line of Germans there. And that seems to be what he'd settled on, that there's nobody in Belleau Wood, or there's a very light defensive screen in here. We can sweep through them. The Germans won't be expecting us. And so he's going in, attacking into a very strong defensive position, a dense woodland, against an enemy of unknown strength. That's dangerous enough, and he's going to compound it because he's going to launch what is effectively, Dan, just a straightforward infantry assault. In terms of coordinating this with a machine gun barrage or heavy artillery or any kind of air asset, which you'd expect from a British or French assault, that's just not going to happen. This is effectively an old-fashioned, I won't even say a 1915 assault. It's a 1914 assault, advancing across open ground through the wheat fields into the wood with the intention of just driving the Germans out when you actually hit that position. And that is a high-risk approach, to say the least.
Yeah, I'm sure we've used the phrase before. In fact, I'm certain we have when we talk about 1914 style infantry against a 1918 defender. I mean, it's a total mismatch, particularly as there's no artillery preparation. As you say, really poor reconnaissance in the lead up. The staff work's not being great. Communication's pretty poor. What's actually going to happen when the attack goes in is that one of the two battalions who's advanced and captured Hill 142 is going to turn effectively to their right, and they're going to assault Belleau Wood from the southwest area, at the same time as two further Marine battalions of the 6th Marines are going to go straight from south to north into the southern edge of Belleau Wood. Now, bear in mind what we described a minute ago here. Belleau Wood itself is tricky once you get in there, but the problem is getting in there in the first place, because in order to do so, they've got to cross very, very flat plains. Belleau is on a high point, and so it does have great lines of sight, really specifically from the south and the west. And that's exactly where these waves of Marines from 5:15 p.m. on the 6th of June 1918 are going to advance. And bravery, courage, determination, all of those things we've covered when we talked about previous battles on this podcast, they're simply not going to work against scientifically placed, well-manned, well-armed German defenders. And there are dozens of machine guns in and around the southern and southwestern edge of this wood. And as these 3 Marine battalions are going to advance forward in really basic formation with no cover, they're going to pay a horrific price. There's going to be, particularly to the one battalion, I think it's the 3rd Battalion of the 5th Marines, who are going to advance really from the western side, they're going to get cut to ribbons in just minutes.
They are, and what the Americans don't realize is that Belleau Wood is occupied by 461st German Regiment. About 1,100 men, commanded by a really tough veteran on the day, a guy called Major Joseph Bischoff. He's fought in the Western Front for years. He's also fought in the Middle East. He'd been part of the German detachments that were fighting along with the Ottomans, and had apparently actually exchanged gunfire with a group of fighters led by Lawrence of Arabia. So he's seen some serious action, and he has put Belleau Wood into a real state of defense. Classic sort of German machine gun defensive position, lots and lots of interlocking machine guns that can engage in different directions. There's also some pre-registered German mortars that can fire into the area that approaches Belleau Wood, and there is German artillery available at the end of a telephone should they be needed. So there's actually tremendous amount of firepower waiting to engage anybody who approaches these woods. And you made a point, Dan, that I think it really hits you when you're actually at Belleau Wood and you are sort of stood around the edges of the German defensive position. When you look back across the ground the Americans are going to attack, you can understand exactly why this is such a tough nut to crack, because you have a tremendous view. If you're a German machine gunner here, you can hide your machine gun within the tree line. You'll carefully clear a line of fire here. Hide it within the tree line. It's low to the ground. You can tack it across, create a huge beaten zone of bullets. You're very difficult to see from the ground, but you have a perfect view of the approaching Americans. And mentioned, Dan, this is a very old-fashioned style attack. Units just marching out, officers carrying their pistols, the men behind them, not running, just marching across in a loosely extended line through these wheat fields. And it's about 500 yards, roughly, from the American line to Belleau Wood. And in most cases, the Americans have gone about 250 yards. So they're in the middle of the field. That means they can't easily withdraw and they can't easily push on. And that's when the Germans give the signal to open fire. And then the advancing Marines, they're hit with just about everything: machine guns, rifles, mortars, and artillery. And we've used the phrase many times on this podcast, all hell breaks loose. But for American Marines, most of whom, in fact, virtually all of whom have not been under fire up until this point, to suddenly find yourself in that wheat field, advancing against it, don't really know what's in the woods, and then suddenly this absolute hail of lead comes at you. Well, it must have been a dreadful experience.
Yeah, absolutely. You can't really imagine just how horrific this was, and what a baptism of fire for these guys going over the top for the first time. I think at this point, we can look a little more deeply into the individuals here, because it's at times like this that those kind of key characters are going to come to the fore. And there's one we've got to mention here. Just can't do this podcast without mentioning him. A man by the name of First Sergeant Daniel Dan Daly. He's actually going to be effectively the company sergeant major. In fact, he is the company sergeant major of one of the companies in 3rd Battalion of the 6th Marines, who are one of the 2 battalions advancing from the south to north into the southwestern corner of Belleau Wood. He is famous within the Royal Marines at the time. He's an absolute legend. He is one of those guys who is a true Marines Marine. He's a New Yorker of Irish Catholic descent. He's tough as nails. He's actually in his 40s by the time he gets here. One of the reasons he might escape the cull of those older generations, because this guy is the holder of not one, but 2 Medals of Honor. He is absolutely is an incredible inspiration. He got his first, I think, in the Boxer Rebellion. I forget now where his second was. Perhaps you remember it, Spence. But this guy is absolutely made of really stern stuff. He is going to be famed in this action in the wheat fields. And you can go and visit pretty much the exact spot for famously shouting out to his men, "Come on, you sons of bitches, do you want to live forever?" It's that famous kind of Marine speech which we hear so often. Truth behind it, actually, Daly himself is interviewed, survived the war, was interviewed later on, and he's asked exactly what he says. And he actually says, and that's almost it. I think he actually says something like, "For Christ's sake, do you want to live forever?" But the concept is absolutely true. And coming from a man like Daly with 2 Medal of Honor, and just staggering amounts of charisma and experience, he is exactly the kind of people these guys are going to look to. And despite that horrific assault as they make their way across the wheat field, I think it's real credit to the Marines and men like Daly that actually some guys are able to get into Belleau Wood and grab a tiny foothold in the southwest corner. And that's pretty special stuff.
It is, and just as you were describing Dan Daly, as you say, a fighting legend. I'd won the 2 Medals of Honor, one in the Boxer Rebellion, one in Haiti in 1915, described as the fightingest Marine in the entire US Marine Corps. In fact, Dan, you were so full of admiration for him, you briefly credited him as a Royal Marine. And so that's how you wanted to make him part of the British Marine outfit. But that sort of courage, that sort of determination is the only thing that can really salvage this advance from total disaster. Because the Germans have waited until the Americans are partly across the wheat field to open fire. And the Germans have done this quite deliberately because it's a sort of deadly situation you find yourself in. You can't retreat, can't advance, and if you stay where you are, you're going to be blown to pieces by the pre-registered German mortars and incoming German field artillery. And that is really, really serious stuff. So you've got to keep moving. But when all your instincts, no matter how well trained you are, all your instincts are for you to dive to the ground, try and burrow into that ground and just keep your head down as all these bullets, all these shells, all these shrapnel bursts are blazing over you. But that's actually the worst possible thing you can do. You're all going to get killed if you stay there. And people like Dan Daly and other officers and Marines perceive this, and they do everything they can to try and keep the advance going. Now, that doesn't mean just marching blindly into the woods, but trying to work forward to the edge of the woods, because the only way you can silence these guns is to get within grenade range of them and try and silence the machine gun positions with a hail of grenades. But if you're in that, it sounds very easy. We're describing this on a podcast. You're listening to it on a podcast. Oh, very easy. You're being machine gunned and shelled. Well, it's obvious. Just keep going. In actual fact, you need really inspirational figures and your own courage and determination to actually do that. The assault across Belleau Wood has produced some really, really vivid accounts, which I'd like to read a couple of them out because I think they give you some feel, some weight to what we've just been describing. It's one thing for us to say, oh, there's lots of bullets and shrapnel shells, but what was it like to actually be under that? And 2 quotes I'd like to particularly pick out. One is from Sergeant David Vincent, who was in the first wave of going over into the wheat field. And he remembered this. He remembered, our company formed the first wave. We went through wheat fields that the machine guns made wave like water. Big shells were bursting in the air, and every shell contained 250 pieces of steel shrapnel. Other shells would throw up large columns of smoke and dirt. It is not an easy thing to keep going forward through all that and see your comrades that you were drilled and trained with for over a year fall at your side, dead and wounded. And another account, which I think is almost elegiac in the way it's written, it's got a sort of haunting feel to it, was by Gunnery Sergeant Dana Lovejoy. He left one of the most evocative accounts picked out with these sort of fragmented images that he remembered from going into this attack where he would be wounded. And he remembered it in various stages. He remembered long, level fields of yellow grain with scarlet poppies whispering to strange breezes and brilliant sunshine. Brilliant blue sky. Birds sing. Is this war? And this is as the attack begins. But of course, this scene soon vanishes. And he remembers as the Germans open fire, looking across and seeing a man fall. And he remembered that man's face is like a mass of bloody rags. He should keep his hands away from it. And why can't someone make him stop screaming? In front of him, another man fell. And he remembered, there goes that boy. He's dead. A second ago alive, now dead. Bullets still thump him. He does not jump as they thump him. Lovejoy himself be badly wounded in the leg, and he remembered, blood is running, my blood. It lies wet and red on the grass. My leg throbs, throbs, throbs. But oh, how blue the sky is. And this sort of almost surreal take on this, I think, is actually found in a lot of veterans' accounts where their memories are sort of very fragmented in the intense stress of it. But I think it captures something really quite poetic about this beautiful pastoral scene suddenly filled with carnage and destruction. And we could spend a long time reading accounts about this action, but I think those two give a good feel. And incredibly, though, Dan, as you've already said, despite this carnage, despite this hail of gunfire and rain of explosive shells, groups of Marines actually make it into the edge of the wood, crossing that deadly ground.
Yeah, it's amazing. And as you were describing there, I was just thinking, how often we've heard that kind of pastoral scene, as you say, that just turned on its head in an instant when that gunfire opens. It's very evocative of the spring of 1917, of the Somme in 1916. Of course, it's not the first time that we've heard it, but it was the first time the Americans had experienced it, certainly in anything like this scale. And it's remarkable they do manage to get across what is a de facto no man's land at that time and grab that foothold. But we should mention here, by the end of the 6th of June, of course, famous for being D-Day, this is a couple of decades before, by the end of the 6th of June 1918, the US Marines here have lost upwards of 1,000 casualties. And let's put that into a little bit of context here for the story of the US Marine Corps. That is more casualties than the Marines have lost in all of the wars, all of the battles, all of the fights that they've fought in their history combined on a single day. That is a staggering loss for a formation such as the US Marine Corps. And, it's of course going to go on. 7th of June, thankfully, is something of a respite. There's some assaults over towards the eastern side of Belleau, up towards the village of Baresh. In fact, Baresh is captured late on the 6th by a couple of dozen Marines who managed to grab a fairly tenuous hold on it. There's also a fairly bungled attempt by the sister brigade, the US Army Brigade on the right-hand side, who get themselves up towards the a particular high point. I forget the number now, 193 possibly. Again, slightly to the east of there. They get up, get counterattacked, and almost cut off, and actually have to be rescued by French troops of the 10th Colonial Division in a fairly desperate fight. But the fight around Belleau at least peters out for a couple of days. It's not really spent until about the 11th when we start to see a major attack once again. And unfortunately, for those guys that have been hanging on to that little foothold in the southwest corner of Belleau, they're going to be in for a really tough time. But the problem is those guys attacking to get into the wood in the first place have still got to cross the wheat fields yet again. Now, they're going to try something new. And this, I think, is part of the story of Belleau generally, in that there is fairly quickly new things tried. So they're going to start plastering this area with artillery, which is going to have an effect.
It is. And this is, of course, in a way, the Americans are being forced to adapt to the realities of a battle on the Western Front. Even though this is not the Western Front as it was constructed in 1916, you're still going to need to start having some combined arms combination, because although the machine guns are what the US Marines focus on in their initial assault, as we know, what really is the big killer in the First World War are artillery and mortars. And it's shocking in some ways that the Marines launch this assault without any artillery support when they begin. And clearly they're going to need to get US artillery fire into the battle. Now, there's various problems actually bringing US artillery into this. The artillery's got to find its gun positions. It's got to engage in counter-battery fire as well. It's got to do something to actually suppress the Germans. And in this sense, the US artillery is inexperienced, whereas the British and to an extent the French have got very, very good at counter-battery work. the Americans still have a lot to learn. And so they tend to turn to massive fire more so than the very careful scientific accuracy the British and the French would use. But it's the beginnings of a combined arms battle. It begins to look more and more like what we would consider a 1917 or 18 Western Front battle. But within the wood itself, of course, the fighting is absolutely point blank. And you mentioned what a dense woodland this is. You are fighting where both Germans and Americans are so close to each other, they can clearly hear each other talking. But you can't see each other because of the undergrowth. You've got artillery fire coming into this. The Germans are also firing poison gas into the wood as the battle goes on, including some mustard gas that's released in parts of the wood to try and deny it to the Americans. Part of the wood catches fire during part of this fighting, which is, of course, extremely disturbing if you're wounded and you're trapped in it. And it feels more and more like the battles that the British Army and indeed the South African Brigade have fought on the Somme in the woodlands down there, with just intense bombardments either side, combined with point-blank fighting in an increasingly devastated area of forest.
Yeah, and there's something to be said about forest fighting as well. It's a particularly niche skill, and in fact, something that the British really hadn't learned until they were forced to in 1916, in the same way that the Americans are forced to here as June goes on and we start reaching those middle days of June. As you say, Spence, this has just descended into an absolute slugfest now within the wood. And there are a number of attacks followed by counterattacks that go on really throughout the 11th to about the 15th of June. And it starts to take an incredibly heavy toll on both sides. To remember, the Germans here are struggling for manpower as well. They're not in a good place, but they do have at least the experience to dig in. And things like having machine guns that won't open fire until American troops get to within 20 meters of it, 25 meters. And there'll just then be a burst of machine gun fire from under a log or behind a half-fallen tree. That's incredibly deadly fighting. It's worth pointing out as well, the wood fighting itself adds extra issues because you get things, for example, imagine firing a high explosive shell into a load of trees. You're multiplying the effect of shrapnel. A slither of wood going 300 miles an hour is going to kill you just as well as a chunk of shrapnel will. And so actually we see people are getting wounded. In fact, people getting wounded multiple times. We have to mention here Lloyd Williams, who is involved in an attack on the 11th of June inside the wood. He is going to be he's actually going to get caught by one of the first gas shells, which is going to be exploded. One of an outrageous number, something like 6,000 that are going to be fired into that wooded area during the length of the battle. He's going to get wounded by the gas at the same time as being wounded by conventional shrapnel, possibly from a tree burst or something like that. Famously, he's going to say to the medics that come to get him, "Don't worry about me, look after my men first." He's actually then re-wounded, this time mortally, as he's being taken out of the wood by stretcher bearers on the 12th of June. So sadly, he doesn't survive the fight. There are many other men in similar situations. But this really boils down, Spence, to just an absolutely grueling attack. Point-blank range, goes on throughout the night as well, stumbling through undergrowth, fallen trees, finding machine guns at no range whatsoever. And we should say, doing all of this wearing a gas respirator as well makes it exponentially harder.
Doesn't it just? And this is grueling fighting. I think you've really got to cross down how point-blank range this is. Because the lines of sight in the woods are so poor, it can't be anything but that. So you've got grenades flying in from angles you don't know. You've got machine guns firing at you at point-blank range where they will literally dismember anybody they hit. There's just so many bullets flying out of them. Woods are on fire. You've made a great point about tree bursts, shells bursting amidst the trees and sending thousands of not only steel shrapnel pieces, but also wood splinters down into you. Poison gas and poison gas pockets as well that linger in the hollows around the wood. So you're moving through the wood, you jump into this, particularly if there's some mustard gas in there, you'll burn yourself very severely, you become a casualty. And just the psychological pressure of the fact the fighting goes on constantly. There's constant skirmishing encounters between the Germans and the Americans as slowly but surely the Americans really batter their way through the woods. And the Germans do counterattack to try and drive the Americans out the woods a number of times. And that's when the Germans find the same problems that the Americans are having. They're getting ambushed. They're being shot up by point-blank machine gun and rifle fire. And the battle goes on for weeks, in fact. The wood itself isn't completely secured until around about the 26th of June. So 20 days on from that initial assault. And I think it's easy to sort of fixate on that almost impossibly heroic advance across the wheat field and then assume, well, the US Marines got into the woods and that was it. Game over. When in fact, there was weeks and weeks and weeks of bitter fighting still to come that would cost, ultimately, the Marine Brigade, 4th Marine Brigade, would suffer 56% casualties. 1,095 killed, 3,615 wounded, many seriously. 56% of the original brigade would become casualties between really the 4th of June and the 26th of June.
Yeah, it's very interesting that we think about Belleau Wood today, and there's I think possibly exactly the same thing that Brigadier General Harbord has here. We start to get a fixation on the wood. I think it's exactly what Harbord does. If you look at the bigger picture, it's actually the assaults on either flank, French assaults, which are really the big story here in terms of the kind of local strategic picture. It's particularly the assault around Bussière and north of Baresh. The wood, whilst it's clearly an issue, it can be outflanked, and it is in the process of being slowly outflanked throughout the entirety of this fight. It's becoming a kind of mini Stalingrad in that both sides really want to hang on to it. The Americans want to prove what they can do. The Germans want to show the Americans that they're certainly not indestructible. And I think both of those things are happening simultaneously. What's really interesting in terms of the picture here, and I think it gives an idea of how poor the communications is and just how difficult it is to understand what's going on, is there are at least 3 occasions during that, at least 3, possibly more, during that 20-odd day period where Harbord sends signals up to division, up to Bundy, and then eventually it goes to Pershing at the AEF headquarters saying Belleau Wood has been captured. Well, on none of those first 3 occasions has Belleau Wood been captured in its entirety. In fact, by the 11th, the Americans are holding about half of Belleau Wood. This is one of those occasions where Harbord sends a communique saying Belleau Wood has been captured. In fact, Belleau Wood becomes such a horrific fight that, in fact, for a period of time, 4th Marine Brigade have to be withdrawn from the fight. Actually, I forget the date entirely, Spence. Perhaps you have it. It's about the 18th of June. They're taken out for about a 6-7 day rest as a brigade of the 2nd Division who have been holding around Chateau Thierry are brought in. So there's a significant army contribution to the fight at Belleau. The Marines are going to come back into the line for the final 2 days, I think the 23rd to the 25th, when Belleau is finally going to be cleared. And I think what's really fitting about this, Spence, is that final northern portion of the wood, which is going to be captured, using for the first time. It's something that you could really call combined arms.
It is. And you made a point that I think is a really good one right at the head of this episode, that this is almost the learning curve in miniature. US 2nd Division has gone through 1914, 15, 16, 17, and 18. And finally, by the end of this grueling battle, it's gone from launching unsupported infantry attacks into improperly reconnoitred, very heavily defended positions and just relying on sheer blood and guts and bravery to get you there, to launching attacks that look recognizably modern within the standards of the day, with carefully coordinated supporting fire, with layered barrages, for example, with significant machine gun support. And it's had to do that it's condensed that learning, as you said, Dan, into just a few weeks. Incredible sort of achievement in that sense, but at a heavy cost. And just as the British and the French, and indeed the Germans, had to learn how to fight, and those lessons are paid for in blood, so too is the experience of 2nd US Division. And I'd like to highlight one little point that is an interesting sort of feature of the Belleau Wood fighting, and this is the relative absence of barbed wire. The Germans do have some barbed wire within the wood, but not that much. And one of the sort of the big what-ifs that has been discussed, I've heard discussed on the battlefield, is what if the Germans had actually seeded the edge of Belleau Wood with a serious barbed wire belt? The Marines would never have been able to get into it. You can't breach barbed wire without artillery fire. They'd have been stuck. And in some ways, perhaps better for the US Army, therefore, to be learning in the context of a semi-mobile battle in 1918, whereas the British and the French had to learn a hard way against assaulting barbed wire, which we've discussed elsewhere. But I don't want any of that to take away from the fact this is a tremendous effort from the US. And though it's paid for its inexperience, it's suffered for its lack of combined arms and coordination. It reminds me of a quote that I've mentioned on the podcast before, and it's 99.9% certain it's apocryphal. I've heard it attributed to Rommel, I've heard it attributed to Guderian, different people, and that's that you can always beat the Americans once, but you never beat them the same way twice. And speaking, of course, to the speed with which the American army, both First and Second World War, can adapt and ultimately overcome. And I think Belleau Wood, though the story is, of course, one of heroism, it's also one of adaptation.
Yeah, absolutely. And exactly as you said, we see that throughout this fight. We see it really as early as the 11th of June when you get that second attack across the wheat fields. You're going to see the same problems here, except instead of attacking in waves, you're now going to start to see groups of men under the kind of characters like Dan Daly who are going to start leapfrogging across ground. You're going to see tactics like posting grenades into machine guns within the wood. You're going to see people using the terrain to their advantage. You're going to see people calling in artillery barrages and using that to allow them to advance forward. All of these things, as you say, I'm entirely in agreement. This is learning curve, not only in miniature, but in fast forward as well. Because, these guys are really picking up this information quickly. They're disseminating it down to other units as well. I should say there's a specific point here where that's not true, and it's glaringly not true. That's when the 4th Marine Brigade is taken out of the line, and I forget from the top of my head, it may be the 7th Infantry Brigade of the 3rd Division who come in and continue the fight. Actually, when they re-enter the wood, or when they enter the wood for the first time, they're going to start their own assaults. You're almost back to the 6th of June from their point of view. They've not attacked before. There's been very little conversation between the Marines and the army at this point. In fact, there's a great argument to make here about, is Belleau Wood really a Marine fight? Well, it's of course not. It's a Marine and an army fight, and there's army artillery and plenty of army troops in the area. It's interesting, though, from the point of view that actually the reason we know Belleau Wood is a Marine fight is down to a war correspondent who is wounded in the wood, in the fighting, and who it's believed he's going to die. He's actually, against policy, named the Marines. It's American policy at that time not to name any units. He specifically says the Marines are fighting at Belleau Wood. That article goes back to the United States, and because they think this guy's going to die, and I'll have to get his name for the next episode, Spence, it's actually allowed through the censor. So they let the Marine word slip in. As a result, the story of the Marines at Belleau Wood becomes intrinsically linked. And we now today famously know Belleau Wood as exclusively a Marine fight. Now, I for one, don't think we do this whole story justice there by missing out a big chunk of the army. Certainly no, the army don't feel that way, having been there last week with a few army officers. But it's a classic story of how, like, the legacy of the fight of Belleau Wood continues. Now, talking of legacy, Spence, as we start to round this one up, though, there are some fascinating other legacy aspects that come out as a result of the Battle of Belleau Wood, and perhaps most famous of all is of course the phrase "Teufelhunde."
Isn't it just? And I think the journalist you're thinking of is Floyd Gibbons, who goes across with a group of Marines actually on the 6th of June, and he's very, very badly wounded, loses an eye, he's very badly injured in the arm. He thinks he's going to die. He's seriously injured, and he gets his report through. And as you say, Dan, this captures a moment that's really important within a US that is absolutely hungry for war news. And I draw a comparison to the sudden reaction to news in 1914 in Britain that the British Army was heavily engaged in the retreat from Mons. And it led to this massive surge of volunteerism that we discussed months and months ago in the Mons episode. In the US news is absolutely itching for big stories, and it's reported enthusiastically on every single story it can get from the Western Front. But up until this point, most of the news has either been not that interesting, extremely small scale actions, or it's been heavily censored, or it's been bad news, like 26th Division getting very badly raided in April. And then suddenly this news comes through, and it really captures a moment. There is news in America that the Germans are launching this heavy offensive, that it's heading towards Paris. There's fear about that. There's news that the Americans are going into the line here. And then there's news that the US Marines have made this incredibly heroic attack. It's portrayed as a counterattack often in the US press that's turned the tide at this moment and that has routed the Germans. And the journalist who's breaking this story, he was there. He's been wounded. He was in the heat of the action. And given what we've already said, that the US Marines already have a reputation within the American public mind, and then this happens, And the US Marines who bill themselves as the first to be in the fight, they have been the first in the fight, or at least that's the image that's portrayed. It's not strictly true, but suddenly it captures a mood. And from this, an entire legend develops. And you mentioned Teufelhunden, which the exact origins of this are lost to history. But at some point, it might be Gibbons himself, it might be another author, it might be a canny advertiser. We don't fully know where this comes from. Comes up with a story that a captured German around Belleau Wood, usually a captured German officer, nearly always a Prussian officer, has described the US Marines as Teufelhunden, which, in the not very grammatically correct German English of the day, is said to mean devil dogs. Now, I know we've got a number of German listeners, and I know we've got a number of German-speaking listeners, and you won't need to be told that the grammar of this just doesn't make any sense. But to an American public at home, the idea the US Marines have become the devil dogs, this fearsome fighting force, is absolutely, it's manna from heaven for the journalists, and indeed for the Marines themselves, who immediately start producing, as early as July 1918, so just a few weeks after the battle, start producing recruiting posters in which they begin to bill themselves as the devil dogs. And I actually have a fantastic postcard from the US from this era, and it's got a big, ferocious American bulldog wearing a 1917 helmet, and he's chasing this rather feeble, slightly effeminate-looking German dachshund who's wearing a pickelhaube. And this postcard actually says, Teufelhunden, the German nickname for the US Marines. And so even then, it became such an element of the story, and so quickly, and it caught fire with an American public that was desperate for these kind of stories, was itching for this kind of thing. And it's still with us to this day.
Absolutely. It's almost, you imagine for a journalist sitting there thinking, I'm really starving for war news. You get all of these elements come together at the same time. And then, of course, you get the famous phrases like, come on, you sons of bitches, do you want to live forever? Uttered no less by no less a man than somebody holding 2 medals of honor who survived the battle, who's 45 years old. All of these kind of elements, they come together. So Devil Dog, Dan Daly. You couldn't ask for a more perfect title as far as that goes. He actually is, and I think rightly, is recommended for a 3rd Medal of Honor. He would be the only man in history to do so if he was to receive it. I think only 39 men in history have had 2 Medals of Honor, starting with Tom Custer, the brother of George Custer. Daly gets 2. He gets recommended for a 3rd, but it doesn't get approved. He ends up with 3rd, plus a Distinguished Service Cross and a Navy Cross, along with a bucket load of other decorations he's got. He's about the most decorated man in American military history, alongside people like Audie Murphy. Absolutely fascinating story. The Teufelhunden thing, Spence, I find really interesting. There's certainly suggestions that the phrase predates Belleau Wood. There's also suggestions that it postdates it considerably. There's whether it actually happens or not, I don't know. I'm fairly skeptical. But the point made, I think, is absolutely one. And there's obviously some journalistic license taken with that. In the same way that there is something which is famous today. I was there about 3 weeks ago, and there was a US Marine had come over from the United States, or perhaps he was based in Paris for a period of time. I met him at the Devil Dog Fountain in the village of Belleau. So Belleau village is just north of the woods. It's a little way north of the wood, I should say, probably 3/4 of a kilometre, something like that. And there in the grounds of an old house, there is a what looks like an actual devil dog. It's like a weird effigy of a kind of hellish dog, which is actually a fountain. So it's got water coming out of it, and it pours into the ground. And it has really, ever since the 1940s, 1950s, been Marines will go there and will drink from the fountain. So if you're a US Marine, you go and drink from the US Devil Dog Fountain. I'd love to know if anybody listening in has done exactly that. Unfortunately, don't want to spoil the party. Wasn't there in the First World War. It postdates the First World War quite considerably. It's also in an area that was still behind the German lines for probably several weeks after the Marines had left. But that's not the point. The point is here that Belleau Wood is a fascinating fight. And Spence, I think to round this one up when it comes to it, we look at the story of Belleau Wood, and I guess we say, is Belleau Wood a war-changing event? Is it strategically or geographically important? I think the answer there has to be no. It's not.
I'm afraid you're absolutely right. It is a bitterly fought action, bloody action, heroically fought action. But does it make a huge difference to the Western Front? No. Does it stop the German advance on Paris? No. As we said, the German advance has petered out. And although I think Ludendorff would love to launch himself again or launch the army again at Paris, that's not going to happen. Is it a turning point? Well, I'm going to actually offer a slightly different view here and say, in a way, it is a turning point, but not because of its tactical or in terms of the ground gained or the casualties inflicted. It's a turning point because the US Army, which up until this point is a largely untested force, has arrived on the Western Front. It's fought a significant battle, and it's won a significant, by its own standards, a significant local victory. And we talked in previous episodes of this set about potential of the US Army. And I think up until this point, that's what it was. It was potential. Nobody really knew how the US Army was going to fight. Not even the US Army, it has to be said. Germans weren't really sure of it. The Allies weren't really sure of it. Americans are confident, but they hadn't got experience yet. But having gone through this battle and ultimately won it, albeit at a heavy cost, this potential is now being turned into real material support for the Allies. And in that sense, you could say Belleau Wood is strategically important, but not because of the ground gained, which, as you've said, Dan, could have been taken in a different way, perhaps a less costly way. But in terms of marking the arrival of the Americans and setting the American army now alongside the French, who are going to be participating in ferocious fighting down in what will become the Second Battle of the Marne, the potential is now real. It's not just a mythical army. For the Germans, the clock is you're in your last seconds. The Americans are here, more than going to be coming, and they're going to be coming in ever greater strength, and they're going to be getting more and more powerful as they go along.
I'm really glad you mentioned that, Spence, and very well said. And to qualify from my own point of view, I agree entirely. Is Belleau Wood a war winner as far as whether the wood is in German or Allied hands? No, doesn't make a great amount of difference. What it does do, though, is, to my mind at least, it shows that the Americans are here. It shows that they're willing to fight, and it shows that they're here for the duration. You've been listening to Not So Quiet on the Western Front, a Battle Guide production. If you've enjoyed this podcast, why not check out the Battle Guide YouTube channel, where we regularly release documentaries exploring some of the most famous and extraordinary episodes from throughout military history. If you'd like to support the Battle Guide team to create more content just like this, why not head over to our Patreon, where for the cost of just a cup of coffee, you can get access to full-length virtual battlefield tours, exclusive behind-the-scenes content, decide which subjects we cover in future podcasts and videos, and join a fantastic community of like-minded people. That's all this time. See you again soon. Use something along the lines, I'm paraphrasing here, but it's something like, I've got to remember what he says. Fuck, what does he say? Yeah, okay.